In the summer of 1987, Yellowstone entered its most familiar phase. The park was crowded, bustling, and filled with a sense of security. The main roads were packed with family cars. Children ran around the campsites, candy in hand, their feet covered in dust. Adults sat by the campfire, chatting and laughing, enjoying their rare days off amidst the vastness of nature. The rangers were used to that rhythm of life. Each day passed with the same questions, repeated so often that they were almost memorized. Where do bears usually appear? Which trail is the easiest to follow? How long should they stay before turning back? Everything was so normal, so familiar, so much like previous summers. Yellowstone, in the eyes of tourists, is a majestic yet friendly place. A vast land, yet it seems to always welcome people with open arms. Here, people believe that as long as you prepare enough, follow the right path, and respect nature, every trip will end safely. But on the Montana edge of the park, where Yellowstone gradually merges into the deep forest, that picture changes slowly. There are no clear boundaries, no warning signs, just the paved road disappearing without a trace. The trail narrows, the sounds of people fade, giving way to the wind, the trees, and the silence. It was in that quiet place that four men began their journey on a mild, sunny morning. The sky was clear and cloudless. There were no signs of a storm, no warnings from the weather or from human intuition. They laughed, adjusted their backpacks, looked at their maps, and entered the forest with the confidence of men who believed they were in control of the journey ahead. None of them knew that, sometimes, the most dangerous thing is not what we see, but the peace that makes people forget that nature never promised to give back to everyone who enters it. These four men were not anonymous names on a piece of paper. They were people with pasts, habits, and relationships deep enough to trust each other in the wilderness. Two of them are brothers, only a few years apart in age. They grew up together, accustomed to sharing everything from their first fishing trips to long treks in the forest. They have a unique unspoken understanding. They don't need many words. A single glance is enough to know what the other is thinking. For them, these trips aren't a challenge, but a way to return to the familiar feeling of youth, a time when the two brothers were always together. The third person is a longtime close friend. Not just a casual acquaintance, but someone who has been with them through important stages of their lives. He understands the pace of their journey, knowing when to slow down and when to keep going. On previous trips, he was usually the one who maintained balance, being cautious enough but not overly anxious. The last person in the group was younger than everyone else. A local student, he grew up near the area. For him, the forests were nothing new. Since childhood, he had been accustomed to pitching tents, reading the terrain, and listening to the subtle changes in nature. His presence gave the group a sense of reassurance, as if they had another person who understood the land they were entering. Most importantly, they trusted each other. No one was dragged along reluctantly. No one seemed anxious or reluctant to participate. They prepared thoroughly, spoke freely, and entered the forest with the mindset of people who believed they knew what they were doing. It is precisely that calmness, that trust, that makes this story all the more heartbreaking. Because these weren't four reckless people. These were four very real, very ordinary people, venturing into nature with all their experience and the belief that they would return. Just like all the times before, that morning, at the ranger station, everything unfolded as usual. There was no tension. No special warnings, just a brief conversation between people who were all too familiar with this routine. The rangers asked about their route. They answered clearly. A less traveled, closed-loop route, with a projected return to the trailhead in 3 days. A map was spread out on the table. The stopping points were already marked. The ranger glanced at it and nodded. This wasn't an amateur group. That was evident in the way they spoke, in the way they understood each leg of the journey. The names of the four were written down. The permit was issued. The return date was circled. A gentle reminder sounded, almost habitually, "Remember to check out when you return." They nodded. A fleeting smile. No one took the moment seriously. But later, it would be the last time their names were recorded in a routine procedure. The dusty station wagon was parked at the trailhead in the mid-morning. Inside, there were still a few things they didn't need to take with them. A spare sleeping bag. Miscellaneous items. Things that showed they believed they would be back soon. The vehicle stood there, silently, amidst the other cars that came and went throughout the day. Passers-by paid no attention. Trailhead was ever-changing. Cars came. Cars went. No one thought that one car would stay longer than expected. No one knew that it was about to become the single, clearest sign that something had not gone according to plan. As the four men crossed the trailhead and ventured deeper into the woods, they carried with them a confidence, experience, and a very human kind of faith. Left behind, the silent vehicle began a role no one wanted to acknowledge. Waiting. All that remained of the four men after that morning were fragmented memories, pieced together from other people's accounts. No one knew what they last saw. Years later, a campsite manager still remembered the image of four men standing around a small campfire. They laughed and talked in low, quiet voices. In their hands was a map that had been folded and unfolded many times. They pointed to a few spots, exchanged brief words, like people accustomed to making decisions in the woods. There was no arguing, no tension. Just the ordinary conversations of men looking forward to their first night in nature. Another person recalled seeing them at a small shop on the edge of the park. A simple, familiar place for hikers. They were buying ice, some dry food, and fuel. Very ordinary items, very familiar to anyone preparing for a trip lasting several days. No one asked for escape routes. No one seemed worried. They stood in line, chatting idly, waiting for their turn to pay. The receipt was printed, clearly stating the date and time. A small, fragile piece of paper, but it would later become the final marker confirming they were still okay, still among the living. No one in the store remembered whether they were in a hurry or not, because there was nothing worth remembering. They were just like hundreds of others who had walked through that door before. And that's what makes this story so poignant. Their final moments bear no sign of tragedy. No farewells. No premonitions. Just very human, very ordinary activities, taking place right before the deep forest closes in and never returns them. The day of the planned return passed quietly. There were no alarms. No one rushed to the trailhead. In Yellowstone, that was normal. Hikers often returned late. The route might be longer than expected. A night of camping might be extended. No one wanted to turn the delay into panic. The first day ended in a quiet wait. The car remained there. A thin layer of dust settled on it. A few other cars came and went. No one noticed. No one observed anything unusual. By the second day, the feeling began to change. The car was still there. The tires were undisturbed. There was no note on the windshield. No sign that anyone had returned during the night. A park ranger passing by glanced at it, noted it down, and continued with his work. Experience had taught them that most cases resolved themselves. People usually returned before things got serious. But by the third day, the silence was no longer easy to ignore. Another ranger, changing shifts, saw the vehicle and lingered longer than usual. He checked the register. The four names were still there. No checkout, no contact, no updates. He walked around the vehicle, looking inside. Everything was still the same, as if time had stood still. The feeling now wasn't fear. It was something heavier. A sense of unease all too familiar to those who work in the forest. When things should have ended, but they didn't. And when the waiting began to bring with it questions no one wanted to ask. When the decision to activate the search and rescue operation was made, the atmosphere in the ranger station changed instantly. The voice on the radio became shorter, clearer. The names on the permits were no longer administrative formalities. They became four people who needed to be found. The first teams left the station early in the morning. They followed their registered route, slowly and deliberately, their eyes always fixed on the ground. To outsiders, it was just a walk through the forest. For the rangers, it was reading the story of what had happened, written in the earth, leaves, and footprints. Initially, everything felt reassuring. Footprints were clearly visible on the trail, evenly spaced, steady strides, no slips, no disorder. Four people walking together, exactly as planned. No one injured, no one panicked. Everything was perfectly normal. Then, almost without warning, the story stopped. The footprints thinned out. In some places, they disappeared completely. There were no clear turns, No broken branches. No sign that they had left the trail. The search team fanned out, following familiar arcs, hoping to find where the group had changed direction. Nothing at all. The feeling at that moment was hard to describe. Not panic, but confusion. Experienced people know that people can't just disappear. If they get lost, there will be signs. If something goes wrong, there will be chaos. But here, the ground seemed to have erased the rest of the story. As the afternoon sun began to fade, the search team had to turn back. That was the procedure. But no one left the forest with a sense of complete fulfillment. For they understood that they had just crossed an invisible boundary. From a hopeful search to something more difficult to name, the place where 4 footprints had led them, then suddenly fell silent, as if the forest had decided to keep the rest to itself. A few miles further along the planned route, the search team discovered a small clearing in the woods. Nothing remarkable at first glance. But to those accustomed to reading human footprints in nature, it immediately took on an unusual feel. A tent was laid on the ground, but not yet erected. The tent stakes were still bundled together. The tarp wasn't stretched taut. It was as if someone had just started, then stopped halfway. The cooking area had been cleared. A few stones were arranged in a circle, properly, carefully, intentionally. But the fire hadn't been lit. There was no ash, no smell of smoke. The food was still there, intact, placed in properly sealed containers, not opened hastily, not spilled. To experienced foresters, this was illogical. People might leave behind many things, but rarely food and shelter, unless something forced them to leave immediately. There were no signs of panic, no belongings scattered around, no footprints of people running in disarray. The ground around the campsite bore only light, regular footsteps, typical of preparations for camping. Everything here possessed an inexplicable calm, as if time had been cut short, not by fear, but by an unexpected interruption. The rangers stood silent for a moment. No one spoke, but they all thought the same thing. The 4 men had planned to stay here overnight. They had felt safe enough to stop. And then, for some reason, they hadn't had time to complete the simplest task, setting up a tent to sleep in. Deep in the forest, where people often leave clear tracks when in danger, this campsite carries a different message. It doesn't tell the story of fleeing. It tells the story of an ordinary moment ended too soon. And that's what sends chills down the spines of those standing here, more than any sign of violence. The working dogs were brought into the area immediately after the unfinished campsite was discovered. They were animals accustomed to the smell of fear, to chaos, to people panicking and fleeing. The handlers trusted their reflexes more than any equipment. Initially, everything went as expected. The dogs had a keen sense of smell. They pulled on the leash decisively, walked confidently, and moved forward as if the path were still perfectly clear. The dog handler almost breathed a sigh of relief. At least, the story was still continuing. Then they reached a rocky ridge. The terrain began to change. The wind grew stronger. The space opened up slightly, revealing a deep gorge ahead, and it was there that everything came to a standstill. The dogs slowed down. They circled in small circles, their noses lowered close to the ground. The leash was no longer taut. Then, one by one, they stopped completely. Not because they had lost their sense of smell, but as if something ahead prevented them from moving forward. The handler gently gestured, urging them on. The response was hesitation, even slight resistance. The stopping point was right on the edge of a deep ravine. A steep gorge, full of rock slides and dense vegetation below. Despite the lack of clear signs, the search team decided to descend and investigate. They moved cautiously step by step, calling out the names of the 4 men, hoping the sounds might provide a response. There was no response, no belongings, no sign that anyone had fallen or passed through this place. Only the wind blowing through the crevices in the rocks, and the very clear feeling that, at this point, all clues had chosen to stop. And sometimes, that stopping is even more terrifying than finding nothing at all. The following day, the weather began to change. The morning was still bright, but by noon, the clouds quickly gathered low. The rain came quietly, just heavy drops falling steadily, enough to soften the earth and erase the faint traces the search team was clinging to. Fog descended upon the forest like a thick curtain. Visibility narrowed to just a few meters. Familiar faces suddenly became blurred behind the cold mist. People had to stand closer together, speak louder, but still felt as if they were lost among their own comrades. The radio started to crackle. Conversations were cut short. The sound distorted, then disappeared completely in some areas. There were moments when the search team stood in the woods unable to contact anyone beyond a few steps. That feeling wasn't unfamiliar, but it was never pleasant. The rain continued to fall, steady and persistent. The earth was compacted. The leaves of the forest clung together. What remained of footprints, scents and stories on the ground was gradually swept away. The weather was not on humanity's side. It didn't care about waiting, hope, or the growing anxiety within each person. As evening fell, everyone understood one thing very clearly. Not only were the four men hidden by the forest, but the truth was also being buried by the weather, hour by hour, minute by minute, in a heavy silence that no one wanted to acknowledge. The families of the four men began arriving in Yellowstone in the following days. They didn't come with the mindset of those who had lost their loved ones. They came with a very human belief that, by simply getting closer, by simply standing where their children had stood, everything would become clear. They stood on the edge of the rangers' quick briefings, listening to every report, which areas had been searched, which areas were still being expanded. Each day, new lines appeared on the map on the table. But the answers didn't get any clearer. The explanations began to be filled with ifs and maybes. The initial hopes were very specific. Maybe they had strayed onto a different path. Maybe they had taken shelter from the rain somewhere deeper in the forest. Maybe they were slightly injured and waiting to be found. These possibilities helped people endure another day. But as time went on, hope began to fade, not because anyone said anything cruel, but because each afternoon ended exactly the same as the one before. No new discoveries. No signs of survival. Not the slightest indication that the four men were still waiting. The searchers were also gradually becoming exhausted. They walked slower. Their shoulders felt heavier. Their eyes were red from lack of sleep. Although unspoken, everyone understood that the forest had not cooperated. And when nature decides to remain silent, humans can only try harder, they cannot force it. That evening, the family returned to their temporary shelter. The lights were still on, the beds were still made, but no one really rested. They lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering a question no one could answer: would things be different tomorrow? In that heavy atmosphere, the most painful thing wasn't fear. It was the feeling of having to learn to wait, as each passing hour made hope a little more fragile, and no one dared to voice what everyone was thinking. The decision to stop the search didn't come suddenly. It came slowly, heavily, after days without any new discoveries. The teams had exhausted all possible search areas. The weather was deteriorating. The terrain was becoming more dangerous for the searchers themselves. And most importantly, the hope of finding survivors had become so slim, it was almost impossible to name it. The announcement was delivered in a cautious tone. No one used the word ending. They simply stated that the official search operation would be narrowed down. Resources would be withdrawn. If new information emerged, they would return. The wording was familiar, very bureaucratic, but to the family, it carried a different meaning. A door had closed, though not yet locked. The files were compiled. The report was completed. 4 names were moved from the search list to a different status. Not found, rather, no answer yet. From then on, their story no longer unfolded in the woods, but lay dormant in the drawers, under the white lights of the office. Winter arrives in the forest. Snow blankets the trails that have been trodden countless times. The last footprints vanish completely. Yellowstone closes itself off, as it does every year, not to hide anything, but because winter always forces everything to come to a standstill. 20 years passed in that silence. No new clues. No explanation. Only the quiet passage of time, carrying with it the memories of those who searched, and the never-ending weight of the families left behind. Throughout that time, the old question remained unanswered. What happened, and why did the forest remain silent all those years? Years later, Yellowstone entered a different phase. Summers were longer. The land was drier. Things that were once rare began to become commonplace. Fires appeared no longer as isolated incidents, but as an inevitable part of the new cycle. When the fires broke out on the Montana side of the park, no one thought about old stories. The priority was controlling the flames, protecting people, and preserving what could still be saved. Smoke filled the sky. The smell of burning permeated every crevice in the rocks and every valley. The forest, which had once concealed so much, was now forced to reveal itself. The fire didn't move hastily. It moved slowly, but decisively. Tree canopies crumbled, bush turned to ash. Areas once inaccessible were barren, revealing the true form of the terrain beneath. After the fire subsided, the landscape was unfamiliar. Pathways vanished. Old landmarks were gone. Yellowstone now resembled a place stripped of its thick layers of memory. When the damage assessment teams returned, they were walking on a completely different landscape. The greenery was gone. Only black earth, bare rocks, and charred tree trunks stood silently. The feeling was difficult to describe. Not exactly devastation, but more like an exposure. As if nature, after years of silence, had changed its form to prepare to say something. Unbeknownst to anyone, within that seemingly desolate landscape, an ancient truth awaited revelation. The fire had accomplished what time had failed to do. It forced the forest to shed its last vestiges of cover, opening a chapter that humanity had been unable to access for the previous 20 years. Right part. 13 Discovery of burnt and deformed metal object. After the fire subsided, the site inspection began quietly. Slow footsteps echoed across the blackened ground. Eyes accustomed to searching for something that shouldn't have been there. And then, in a very ordinary moment, a park ranger stopped. At first, what was revealed looked like mere debris. A curved piece of metal peeked out from beneath the ash and rocks. Not rusted in the way of old scrap metal. Not straight in the way of industrial tools. He bent down, gently brushing away the ash with his gloved hand. The shape became clearer. A warped aluminum frame, deformed as if it had been subjected to intense heat. Around them, more fragments appeared. A compass casing charred black. Cooking utensils stuck together, warped, as if they had been overheated without anyone witnessing it. These weren't discarded trash. These were personal belongings. Things people carried with them, believing they would return. The area was immediately marked. The coordinates were carefully recorded, and at that moment, a detail caused many to fall silent. This location was not on the route that had been registered years ago. It was behind a ridge, in an area once so densely forested that no one thought it was inaccessible, a place no one had ever accidentally wandered into. The feeling at that moment was clear. Not excitement, not fear, but a familiar heaviness for those in this profession. What had just been found was not just metal. It was a question buried for 20 years, now laid bare in the light, forcing people to look directly at something they had never touched before. The excavation began in silence. No one spoke loudly. No one hurried. Each shovel stroke was slow and shallow, as if afraid to hurt the very memories lying beneath the earth. Ash gave way to a layer of harder soil. Rock was revealed. Then a different color appeared, paler, uneven, unmistakable. The first fragments were tiny, charred, brittle. No explanation was needed. Everyone understood what they were. Human beings. No longer a hypothesis. No longer an archive. 4 people who had been missing for 20 years were now present, in the most fragile form they could possibly have. As the excavation area expanded, something struck everyone into silence. The bone fragments lay close together. Not scattered, not stretched along the slope, not dispersed by water or animals. They were clustered in a very narrow area, as if the 4 men had been together in their final moments. The subsequent analysis confirmed what many had sensed from the beginning. All 4 were there. No one had gone any further. No one had left anyone behind. In the moment when everything ended, they didn't separate. They stayed together. For those who participated in the search all those years ago, that moment brought a feeling that was difficult to describe. There was relief, because they had finally been found. But there was also a silent pain, because the biggest question had been answered, in a way no one wanted. For the family, the news was both comforting and heartbreaking. Comforting, because their children were not alone. Heartbreaking, because no one could know exactly what happened in those final moments. All they knew was that, in the deep forest that had been silent for 2 decades, 4 people had stopped together, and the earth had held them together until now. The work of forensic science begins after emotions have subsided. There are no more burnt forests, no more ashes. Only cold facts remain, which must be interpreted accurately. And it is precisely what is absent that becomes the most noteworthy. There were no signs of violence, no cuts, no trauma from impact, no indications of a fight or human intervention. The skeletons carried no story of conflict. They were silent, yet remarkably clear. There were no animal tracks, no bite marks, no claw marks, no the usual scattering that occurs when humans face wild animals. Anyone who has witnessed the aftermath of an attack in the forest understands that nature always leaves a very clear mark. Here there was nothing like that, and most importantly, they didn't scatter. The four of them didn't run in four different directions. No one tried to escape alone. No one left anyone behind. In panic situations, people often react instinctively, but this scene doesn't tell the story of survival instincts being activated. Forensic experts offered no answer, but they closed many doors. What didn't happen gradually became clear. And that very void opened the way for another question, colder, harder to accept. If it wasn't humans, not animals, not panic, then what caused the four people to stop, in silence, in the middle of the deep forest? Once the familiar doors closed, investigators were forced to look at the ground in a different way. Not for footprints, not for the killer, but for something invisible, something that left no sound or smell to warn people. The area where the four people were found is low-lying, surrounded by rocks and slopes. This type of terrain can trap heavy air. Geological data suggests that beneath this land exist small geothermal systems non-erupting, non-evaporating, but capable of releasing gas under certain conditions. This gas is colorless, odorless, heavier than air. When it accumulates near the ground, it doesn't cause immediate pain. It just slows things down, a slight dizziness, a feeling of disorientation, then it weakens. In just a few seconds, the body may no longer be able to react. The experts described the scenario with remarkable composure. One person collapsed first. The others, reacting instinctively, stopped, bent down, called out their name, and tried to help. No one thought of running away. No one understood that staying close together actually increased the danger. There was no time for fear, no moment to decide. Just the rapid collapse of healthy bodies, in the midst of what seemed like a perfectly normal afternoon. That explains why they didn't scatter, why there were no signs of panic, and why everything ended within such a narrow scope. It wasn't an easily accepted explanation, but it was the only explanation that made all the previously silent pieces begin to fit together. In those brief seconds, nature did something that humans didn't realize it was doing. It took away the ability to react before it could leave any warning. The final report was not written with emotion. It was written with restraint. Every word was carefully considered, not to evade responsibility, but to avoid promising something the evidence could not guarantee. There were no absolute conclusions, no definitive statements, only what best fit what had been found. Investigators avoided using definitive words. They didn't say it was the sole cause. They said it was the most plausible scenario, consistent with the terrain, consistent with the forensic results, consistent with the fact that the four people didn't scatter, didn't panic, and didn't leave any familiar signs of life. Consistent with the silence that lasted for 20 years. In closed-door meetings, someone revealed something that the report couldn't explicitly state. If there hadn't been a fire, if the forest hadn't been stripped bare, perhaps this truth would never have been seen. Not because someone was hiding it, but because nature had hidden it too well. For the family, the report didn't bring complete relief. It didn't turn back time. It didn't answer every question, but at least it put an end to a period of uncertain waiting. The people they loved hadn't vanished meaninglessly. They were there. They had been found. And their story, imperfect as it was, finally had an explanation sufficient for people to learn to accept. The fire didn't kill those four men. It only passed through last, long after everything was over. What the fire did was force the forest to shed its covering, to force the earth to return what it had kept secret for 20 years. In this story, there are no villains, no conspiracies, no obvious mistakes to point fingers at. Only humanity, with all its preparation experience, and a very real belief that nature will eventually allow them to return. And only nature, vast and indifferent, completely unaware of what it has just taken away. Perhaps the most poignant thing isn't how they left, but that they did everything right. They were together, they trusted each other. They didn't leave anyone behind. In their final moments, they didn't scatter in panic. They stayed together just as they had started their journey. Yellowstone remains bustling every summer. The roads are still full of cars. The trails are still walked by people every day. Few know that beneath the once scorched earth, there once lay a story waiting to be revealed. If you're still here, take a moment to remember those 4 real people. And in the comments, share which detail of the story left you speechless the longest. Every like, every channel subscription not only helps the video spread, but also helps these buried stories continue to be told. Because some truths don't disappear. They just wait for time, for fire, and for someone patient enough to listen.